Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our webinar today. And today's conversation is brought to you by the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights at Harvard Kennedy School. The center is founded in 1999, and the center is Harvard Kennedy School's hub for human rights research, teaching, and policy engagement. Over the past 25 years, the center has tackled some of the most urgent and complex challenges of our time, from genocide and torture to technology and human rights to racial justice and LGBTQI rights globally. And today, I'm deeply, deeply honored to introduce our guest Professor Ronald Heifetz. Professor Heifetz is a King Hussein bin Talal Senior Lecturer in Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School and the founder of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard, one of the most influential institutions for leadership development in this world. And for over 4 decades, he has done something real. He didn't just study leadership, and he built an intellectual foundation for what leadership actually means in the modern world. His landmark book, Leadership Without Easy Answers, my favorite book this year, published in 1994, remains one of the 10 most assigned books at Harvard. And his online course on adaptive leadership has reached over 800,000 people globally. Um, but perhaps the most telling testament to his impact came in 2016 when the president of Colombia stood at the podium to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. And in that speech, he acknowledged the influence of Professor Heifetz's work on his leadership through one of the most complex peace processes of our time. And I also want to share a small story personally. When I was a student at HKS, actually, we really, really desperate for Professor Heifetz's class. But that year, it was not offered. So today, I was more than excited to work with you, to work with Professor Heifetz, to learn more about adaptive leadership with all of you who are the LGBT leaders and leaders in other domains around the world. So now, Professor Hafiz, thank you for being here. We are so ready for this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ying. And thank you, Diego and Anna, Karina, for inviting me to speak, and also to Tim McCarthy, my old friend and colleague, for also inviting me and encouraging me to spend time with you. It's a real pleasure to get to spend time with you today, and to some of you may be already acquainted with my work, and some of you may be new to my work. It's not only my work; it's the work of many people whose shoulders I've stood on in my lifetime of theory building and of teaching, and who have also carried on this work in new ways and taken it to new places. Today, I'd like to do two different things. I'd like to introduce you to the basic foundational ideas of the theory of leadership that my colleagues and I have developed. And second, I'd like to make sure I spend a little time talking about what I would call staying alive. People trying to exercise leadership frequently develop or accumulate a set of scars on their backs. It's a difficult thing to be challenging people to face difficult questions that ask them to renegotiate some loyalties to their own tradition or heritage, or to keep people in their lives. Leadership itself would be an easy job if it were all about distributing good news. If leadership were all about win-win solutions and positive sum outcomes, it would be a much, much easier job. But leadership becomes dangerous when you represent a challenging set of questions, or from a data analytics point of view, if you generate data on an organization that the organization doesn't really want to have to face into, because the data represents an internal contradiction or a set of risks that the company doesn't really want to have to acknowledge. So leadership then becomes dangerous. Uh, and even though you may believe deep in your heart that ultimately you're operating on people's behalf and on their highest values, in the immediacy of challenging people, people will frequently respond in a defensive way, and one of the key defenses, obviously, is to attack or to try to neutralize the message of those people who are raising those challenging questions. Anyone in the LGBTQ plus community uh, is raising challenging questions into deeply held traditions and deeply rooted senses of identity, in religious identities, gender identities, political identities, and cultural identities. So leadership then within your particular set of communities, you're not one community, you're many, many communities, but within your set of communities, my guess is that many of you know what it means to accumulate scars on your back, to be told things that are mean and ugly, and to have to somehow figure out how to stay in the game. First of all, stay in the game of life, and second of all, stay in the game of trying to practice leadership in moving forward on the challenges of social justice. So I'd like to at least conclude with some remarks about staying alive. Um, but before I get into that, I'd like to introduce you to some of the basic principles in how I think about leadership. You know, when I began teaching at the Kennedy School in 1983, I was a young man. I was only 32 years old. I'm now 75 years old. Um, when I was 32 years old, I had just finished my medical training, and or at least the beginning of my medical training. I had started training in surgery, and then I took a year off after my first year of surgical training to uh, to go back to study music. I had spent a lot of time growing up studying music. I had taken a year off in college studying music. I play the cello, and after finishing my first year of residency in surgery, I decided I'd give myself another year off. So I did that. I took a year off, and I had already signed up for studying neurosurgery, which is where I thought I was going to end up. My father was one of the great neurosurgeons, brain surgeons of his generation, and I thought I'd like to go into business with him. But during that year off, I was studying music at Juilliard, which is a conservatory in New York City. And during that year, I had to make a living. And the easiest way for me to make a living to support my musical habit was to work as a young doctor on what we call moonlighting jobs, you know, sort of part-time jobs on the side that you can get once you're licensed to practice medicine. And the first moonlighting job I was able to get was for the prison in New York City. It's called Rikers Island Prison. If you've ever flown into LaGuardia Airport, you fly right over Rikers Island Prison. Of course, usually the pilot doesn't say, everyone, look out the right side of your airplane. If you're sitting on the right side, look out your window, you can see Rikers Island. What they usually say is, if you're flying from Boston, you know, south to New York, they say, look out your right window and you can see the Manhattan skyline. But actually, if you look down, you can see the prison. Um, and uh, and I remember then being 28 years old and working, driving across that bridge from Queens into over to Rikers Island Prison, and it was a really a daunting experience. It was not a population of people that I had spent much time with growing up as a privileged person in America. Uh, but the prison really changed my whole career because it enabled me to get to know and to spend a lot of time examining many, many different people as they'd come into the prison from local jails and were entitled to a medical exam. And from having even brief encounters with many of these young people, most people are young coming into a prison, um, the patterns of social illness were pretty striking. Nearly everybody in the prison had experienced injustice in their lives, quite deep injustice. They, they had experienced a fair amount of trauma in various ways. There were no firstborn sons from the wealthy suburbs coming into Rikers Island prison during the night. There were very few people who had my background. Nearly everybody was poor and had experienced, again, a lot of injustice. And in their own perverse way now, they were sort of taking their piece. They were doing justice, for themselves. But of course, in the end, landing themselves in jail. So that changed my career. I decided I wanted to figure out how to be a doctor at the systemic level, at the aggregate level, to work on social illness rather than individual illness. And so I set myself adrift. I canceled my neurosurgical residency contract and began to wander. After finishing the prison experience, after about 5 or 6 months, I took another job, a very strange moonlighting job. Strange because it was like on the other side of the moon from the prison. It was at a fancy clinic in Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, examining corporate presidents and senior vice presidents of major companies. And these folks were also entitled to a medical exam, but not because they were coming into a prison, but because they had a fringe benefits package that entitled them to an annual exam. And I worked in this clinic examining these guys. And so for nearly a year, and most of them were men, this was 1979, most presidents and senior vice presidents of companies were men at that time. Still, unfortunately, the truth. But I learned a lot from examining these folks. I learned how stressful positions of authority can be. I learned how many people in positions of authority, I would say nearly half of the people, were not living very healthy. They were stressed out in one way or another. They were eating badly. They were smoking too much. They were drinking too much. They were burning out their marriages and their home lives. And that got me interested in the challenges of leadership. So I put these two things together, my interest in public problems and my interest in leadership, and I began to develop for myself a program in leadership studies. At the time, there were no graduate programs in leadership anywhere in the country. There was no place I could go study leadership or do a doctorate in leadership. So I had to kind of make up my own program. And so in making up my own program, my first stop was to finish my medical training in psychiatry. I thought that would give me tools. And then I did a master's degree at the Kennedy School, where some of you have trained as well. And during that mid-career program, I took courses on public management and conflict resolution and peacekeeping, and tried to understand as much as I could that might apply my particular interests to the challenges of public leadership. I also had developed a musical workshop to teach creativity and evolved that into a workshop on leadership. And then started teaching at the Kennedy School. The dean at the time, Graham Allison, was a very unusual guy, and he was creative. He still is, enormously creative man. And he said, well, I'll take a chance on you. You want to develop a curriculum in leadership? We don't believe it can be taught. Nobody believes it can be taught. But, you've got these innovative techniques using music. You go see what you can do. So he gave me a year. And those courses went very well. And as a product of that, I've survived the Kennedy School, not without my own scars over time, but I've survived for 42 years. Now, one of the key things I learned from studying, working with these executives back in my early 30s, is that authority and leadership are not the same thing. And that was the first big insight. Wow, leadership and authority are not the same thing. You're not a leader just because you're president of a company or president of a school board or president of a country or prime minister. You're not a leader just because you're head of a committee or the head of a platoon or a commanding officer. Those are all positions of authority. And when I began to distinguish leadership from authority, along with a very close friend and colleague of mine at the time, Dr. Riley Cinder, Riley and I realized, well, if leadership's not the same as authority, if you uncouple leadership from authority, then a whole new world opens up. First of all, we can begin to examine the question, why is it that so many people in positions of authority don't practice leadership? Where many of us complain about the lack of leadership from people in authority positions. We say the leaders aren't leading. But, you know, if we're a little more precise in what we're saying, what we really mean to say is that people in high positions of authority are not practicing leadership. So then we can begin to analyze, well, maybe having a senior authority position is a constraint on leadership and not just a series of resources. Maybe there's both advantages but disadvantages to being the boss if you want to practice leadership. Maybe in order to gain a position of authority, you have to make a lot of different people happy. You know, in an election, you have to meet the expectations of a lot of different constituents. And it becomes hard then to challenge those same constituents. Because, you know, let's say you get elected and then you go to the state house or the, city council or the school board or the national government, and you learn a lot because you're now studying the issues full time. What happens when you learn things that make you realize, you know, some of the things that my constituents want, I can't give them. In fact, some of the ways my constituents think are problematic. I'm going to have to go back home to my own people and disappoint them. Well, but if I disappoint them, I could lose my next election. So we can begin to see that the moment you gain a position of authority, you're not actually a person free with power, unlimited power. You're actually like a puppet on a string with more strings attached, with more people trying to pull the strings, telling you which directions to go. So by distinguishing leadership from authority, I could begin to analyze how anybody in a position of authority was also carrying a lot of expectations. And those expectations were both a source of power, but they were also a constraint. Let me share with you this first slide to try to represent then so I began to see that authority relationships are everywhere in our lives, from the lowest unit of a family to every kind of organizational setting. Our organizations consist of authority structures, and authority structures consist of a relationship in which party A entrusts power to party B in exchange for a service. We call that authorization. You know, you hire a car mechanic and you say to the car mechanic, I entrust you with power over my car, but I expect services. I expect you to treat me in a trustworthy fashion, which means you're going to execute the service competently and with integrity. Both. Your heart's going to be in the right place, but you're also going to be competent. And every authorization then consists of these three elements: power that's entrusted for services. It's a contract. It's a social contract, as Rousseau described back in the 1700s. So every time a person votes, they're actually the source of power. And if you get collective power, people in authority realize that their power is contingent on the collective agreement of their sources of authorization, which means the citizens. Excuse me. On the other hand, leadership frequently means having to renegotiate the expectations upon which your trust is based. Think of how difficult that is, People trust you to represent a point of view that they care deeply about. And now you've gone and learned and had an awakening and realized there's something wrong with that point of view. But now you have to go home and say to the people, in party A, you have to say to those people, I can't quite deliver the services that you're looking for. You have to change some of your expectations. I can provide you services, but differently. The moment you do that, people in party A may say, well, we're not going to trust you anymore. We're going to put our trust someplace else. We'll put our trust in somebody who tells us what we want to hear, not what we need to hear. And then you get what we see quite a lot in politics in countries all around the world. You get politicians who pander to people, who tell people what they want to hear rather than telling people really what they need to hear, who try to provide easy answers rather than tough questions. So distinguishing leadership from authority begins to enable us to analyze why people in positions of authority often fail to lead. The second category that emerges the moment you distinguish leadership from authority, we can begin to analyze all the leadership that has taken place every day all around our societies around the world, in our neighborhoods and in our families, and all the leadership that's taken place historically without authority. People who did not have authorization, people who were never appointed, who are not anointed, who are not elected, who weren't hired to raise challenging questions, but they just decided to take it upon themselves to rally people and pull people together to represent some important questions or challenging points of view. And we see actually when we begin to look there, we see actually that there's been a heck of a lot of leadership all over the countryside without authority or beyond people's authority. Sometimes it takes place in the middle of our organization where people decide, the challenge we're facing in this business or in this school or in this government agency falls across boundaries. And I can't really work this problem if I don't reach out across organizational boundaries and corral people over whom I have no authority. I can't call them into a meeting, but they're relevant. So somehow I've got to create a new working group of people across boundaries. And I have to provide leadership across these authority boundaries, beyond my authority, if we're going to actually work this collective problem together. And we find also then people leading without any authority from the streets, challenging the dominant institutions or challenging the school board or challenging whichever aspect of the business or political community to face into certain internal contradictions in their value set. For example, in the United States, we've been saying since our founding 250 years ago that all people are created equal, and that there are inalienable rights for all people. But it's still a challenge for us to live that way. We still live with internal contradictions between what it really means to believe, even in a religious sense, that we're all children of God, and at the same time to have these sharp disjunctions and contradictions in how power and justice is distributed. So, there are a lot of people who've been practicing leadership without authority throughout human history, and certainly across our societies. Maybe the most illustrative example is the pandemic that we all just lived through a few years ago. During the COVID pandemic, during the lockdown, you saw people practicing leadership in families, in individual schools, in small businesses, in large businesses, in churches and synagogues and temples and mosques, in small governments and medium governments and large governments. You saw people exercising leadership all over the landscape. And you also saw people failing to exercise leadership all over the landscape. And you could indicate, and the chief indicator for when you had people practicing leadership and people misleading people is the death rate. In places where you had misleadership, where people pandered to the people rather than challenging them to do what they needed to do to live safely, the death rate went up. And in places where you had people rallying their families or their communities or their schools to come up with a better adaptation and to figure out how to reduce the casualty rate, you had low casualties and families not going into dysfunction, with violence and divorce when everyone was stuck at home and feeling overwhelmed. You had schools, classrooms that began to work better, even though they had to work remotely. You had innovative preachers who figured out how to do church, even a church of 50 people when you couldn't get together, in prayer, or rabbis or priests or ministers or mullahs, or some people practiced leadership and others didn't. Some had authority and others didn't. And I think we can all, if we look around, we can see how much leadership needed to be distributed from people in authority, from people in the middle of authority, from people without authority, if we were going to address the challenge called COVID. Okay, so that was the first big distinction. The second of these three foundational ideas is viewing leadership as a practice. Most people view leadership as a set of personal characteristics. So-and-so's got the right stuff. They're charismatic. They speak really well. They look like a leader, quote, leader. They have the right color, the right build, the right X, Y, and Z. And every culture actually has its particular criteria for what it means to become a, quote, leader. Really what the societies mean, what those cultural cues determine, is not leadership, it's authority. Every community has its particular algorithm for what it looks like to be an authority figure, to be somebody you can lean on in times of uncertainty, somebody you're supposed to be able to trust. And those determinants of what it means to be an authority figure are culturally determined over many generations. Now, when we begin to view leadership as a practice rather than a set of personal characteristics, we can begin to see that different contexts, different organizations, different social environments, different cultural moments require different personal characteristics. In some places, the personal characteristic of being, loud and aggressive will gain you authority. In other situations, it'll work against you. So when you begin to view leadership as a practice, you begin to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all set of characteristics of what it means to, quote, be a leader. Practicing leadership can be practiced from many different positions in a society. Again, with authority, with just some authority, or without any authority. It can be practiced by people who look one way or look a different way, because it's a practice. In the same way that one could practice medicine or practice law from many different locations. One can practice healthcare from many locations in a society or community. So viewing leadership as a practice all of a sudden liberates leadership from simply having a position of authority or having, quote, the right stuff. Instead, we can anchor leadership in as a line of work, because that's what it means to say it's a practice. It's a line of work, like any craft, like carpentry, or like surgery, or like being a musician. It's an activity in life with a particular set of purposes in mind. And if we look at what defines any line of work, like carpentry, it's not the skills you bring, and it's not your particular toolkit. It's the fact that you're in the business of working a particular set of problems in the world, generally problems of construction. Same thing if you're a surgeon. You may also have many of the same skills as a carpenter, good hands. You may even have some of the same tools, some of the same drills and saws and screws, if you're an orthopedic surgeon. But what makes you an orthopedic surgeon isn't your skills, and it's not your toolkit. It's that you're working problems called problems with the bones in people's bodies. So if we define leadership as a line of work, as a practice, it opens up whole new terrains for how to think about leadership as it could be practiced from many different locations in a community. But then it raises a really critical question. What are the kinds of problems for which you need leadership rather than a car mechanic, rather than a carpenter, rather than a surgeon, rather than a managerial expert, a financial expert? For what kinds of problems do we need leadership in that line of work? So as I thought about that question, the domain of challenges that are specific to leadership as a practice, I began to develop a spectrum of services that move from, and I will show you a slide on this, a set of services that move from expert and technical challenges on one end of the spectrum to adaptive challenges on the other end. Some people call these wicked problems. Some people call these cultural problems. I like to call them adaptive problems because there's a great deal of richness from biology, which we can talk about some other time, as a metaphor for understanding the processes of change and innovation in a social system. The key thing here, though, is there are an enormous number of problems in our lives for which we need people with authoritative expertise, with technical know-how. Every day in medicine, doctors save lives because they've got the technical know-how and because the organizational systems are in place to process a patient who comes into the emergency room in a crisis and to define that patient's problems, stabilize that patient, and then send that patient off with a cure or into the hospital for further diagnostic analysis and treatment. Every day we save lives because we've transformed what used to be adaptive challenges into technical problems with the evolution of human know-how. But we still face today a whole host of challenges that we would call adaptive, where you can't put people to sleep and fix it for them, where the problem continues to remain in the lives of people. For example, even during the pandemic, you could finally invent a cure for the pandemic, or at least a cure for most death in the pandemic, called a vaccine. But even then, you couldn't persuade people to take the vaccine. In the same way that you couldn't persuade people before the vaccine to put on a mask or to be more careful. And therefore, the death rate went up. There are a lot of problems that you can't solve unless the people themselves do the changing, because the problems can't be distilled from the people. Problems where the people, in a way, are the problem. And therefore, the solution requires engaging people in those solutions. And obviously, then, the challenges that many of you care deeply about as a product of your own evolution and the evolution of your own identities involve a set of adaptive challenges to our legal systems, our educational systems, our family systems, and our religious systems, and our political systems. So They're not technical challenges. Um, Even if you change the law, which is huge, the changing of the law has usually been the outcome of adaptive work that finally enabled that law to be changed. And even after you change the law, it doesn't, you haven't, the work hasn't stopped. It doesn't actually solve the entire problem. There remains a large segment of the community that has not internalized the new values embedded in that new law. The work is ongoing. The law, in a sense, represents simply a new teaching moment in that society, a new stimulus or boundary condition against which hopefully people will learn and rethink some of their prejudices and traditional values. But leadership continues to be required because that law in and of itself is not going to do the work. It'll help, it'll be catalytic, but it won't do the work. I mean, to use a medical analogy, you can take a person with heart disease and do surgery and give them new vessels to their heart. But after surgery, if they keep smoking and if they keep eating poorly and if they fail to get exercise, those vessels will clog up once again. So every patient after surgery gets the sermon: stop smoking, eat better, get exercise. But it turns out it's really hard for people to do. It's easier to pass a law, actually, than it is to change a cultural norm or a cultural value. So leadership requires then, as a first challenge, the diagnostic task of distinguishing those parts of the challenge that are technical, that can be treated with authoritative command, from those parts of the challenge that are adaptive and that require management of ongoing processes of social learning, where you're building new capacity in people, where you can't just put people to sleep and fix it, but where even after you fix the technical parts, people wake up and the problem is still embedded in some of their own habits and traditions. So when you're mobilizing people then to do adaptive work, and that's how I would define leadership. Leadership is a practice that can be practiced with and without authority, where you're mobilizing adaptive work so that people can thrive in a changing and challenging set of environments. And adaptive work requires answering three critical questions. What cultural DNA will we conserve? What do we want to hold steady and build from? But what cultural DNA needs to be discarded or lost? And what innovation, what new ways of thinking, what new ways of doing things need to be married to our tradition so that we can bring the best of our heritage into the future? Now, one of the key lessons from nature is that highly transformative change is highly conservative. And that means that you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. When you're representing the change, and the change module consists of the loss and the innovation, you know, this 10% over on the right side of the spectrum, you have to pay attention to the 90% of cultural DNA, of tradition and values and heritage and language, to be honored, to be respected, to reinforce, so that you're not frightening people more than you need to. Because when you're asking people to give up something that's rooted in their tradition and in their heritage and in loyalties to their families and grandparents, and sometimes anchored in loyalties to sacred texts, you're going to generate a lot of resistance. When you're asking people to be disloyal to their own families and heritage and tradition. Frequently, they will rather die or kill than have to feel that they're betraying their own people. So one has to spend a lot of time speaking to that part of the cultural DNA to be honored so that they can put the losses in the context of the larger sweep of tradition that you're also conserving. I emphasize this because this is one of the major mistakes that people in leadership make. They're so earnest and so enthusiastic about the change that they don't spend enough time analyzing the not change, analyzing what to honor and conserve from tradition. And therefore, they generate a great deal more violent resistance and backlash than they need to be doing. So in the evolution of social change, one wants to generate a departure point from the past. But it's not a 150-degree turn. It's not a 180-degree departure point. It's maybe a 20 or 15 or 10% angle of a departure. That's a significant departure. And it will feel radical to people. But our job in the practice of leadership is to make it feel and to make it be less radical, in the sense that you're not uprooting, all of the roots of a people and their community and their identities and their tradition. You're just uprooting some of it, a small part of it, so that larger organism can grow in a healthier and more robust way. Okay, so let me stop there. I've introduced 3 foundational ideas. Leadership is distinct from authority. It can be practiced with and without authority. Leadership is a practice. It's something you do. It's not something you are by nature. Many different kinds of natures practice leadership some days and not the other days. During the pandemic, some people stepped up to the plate and saved their families, saved their classroom, and others exercise leadership, may indeed exercise leadership on another set of issues. So leadership is a practice that's practiced sometimes and not other times by different people. And third, leadership is a practice in a particular line of work called adaptive work, where you're challenging to answer these 3 questions. What cultural DNA shall we conserve? What do we need to discard? And what innovation will let us take the very best of our heritage and tradition into the future? Now, engaging those questions is a dangerous enterprise. So I'd like to open it up for questions now, but then I'd like to at least save a few minutes to talk about how to stay alive in the practice of engaging people in social change.
So, Professor Heifetz, we have a number of questions that I think fit well within the opening. We have a question from Maya who says, what advice do you have for young leaders who find themselves in positions of authority, or maybe early, but didn't manage or leverage the experience well? And how can people best move forward and grow after leadership failures? And then the other one that's good to answer here is what is the quality of charisma or influence, and how does that affect leadership authority? Can an authority who panders to people lead effectively if they have a charismatic nature? So I think those are the 2 that go to the core. We have 2 more if you have time after those.
Yeah. Why don't you pick one of those to begin with, and so let me just do one at a time because I can't hold on to more than one question at a time.
Yeah, why don't we do the one about finding yourself in a position of authority and maybe failing, but how you can learn from that and grow from the experience.
Okay. Leadership is a high failure enterprise. You fail more often than you succeed because it involves innovation. And innovation itself is an experimental process. It's like when Microsoft first came out with Windows, it came out with Windows 1.0 and it thought it had a great product, but it failed. And so it then revised it and came out with version 1.1 and it failed. And then again, 1.2 and it failed, and 1.3 and it failed. And finally, it then came out with another big revision, version 2.0, and it failed. And then 2.1 and it failed. It just kept failing over and over again. But they stayed in the game. And finally, they came up with version 3.0, and all of a sudden, Windows began to sell. And then it began to recoup its losses from having failed so long. And now, we're all using, many of us are using, those of us who use PCs, Windows 11. But each generation built on the mistakes and the failures of the previous generation. The challenge in leadership is to keep moving, even though you failed. Right now, people are playing the World Cup, and the very, very best striker only scores a goal, a small percentage of the time, compared to how often they kick the ball towards the goalpost, the net. So failure comes with the territory. The challenge, of course, is to debrief your failures and to try to learn whatever you can learn from either the tactical or strategic mistakes that you made. One of the first principles I teach people in staying alive is to get on the balcony, which means to pause sometimes many times during the day, but at least debrief at the end of the day or during the week with yourself or with confidants, and try to debrief and ask yourself, what did I miss? What mistakes did I make today? And every day we make at least micro mistakes. I should have talked to Sally before I talked to Harry. I should have framed the issue this way rather than framing it that way. I should have picked a better time to talk to my boss rather than speaking at that time. I should have done a little more homework, before moving forward. So every day we make lots of mistakes. And if you can have the courage to face into your mistakes every day, it'll increase the chances that you'll keep correcting for your mistakes and they won't compound into a fatal error of getting neutralized or kicked out. But even when you do get neutralized and kicked out, it's still simply another opportunity, a painful one, to debrief with people who are confidants and try to, in a cold and analytical way, analyze the mistakes that you made. And what I hope is that all of you are generating a community now of practice where you can call each other in the middle of the day or night and say, this is what happened to me. Help me debrief. What mistakes did I make? And I also hope, as you continue to learn the framework that I'm introducing you to, you'll begin to learn a framework of analyzing those mistakes so that you can figure out what lessons there are to capture from having failed and being neutralized, so that you can get back into the game and try again with more insight. To practice leadership, we want you to be a smart troublemaker. We have a lot of wonderfully passionate, inspired troublemakers who are making mistakes all over the place. I mean, from my point of view, passionate social justice warriors got Donald Trump elected. That's a real problem. What lessons are there to be learned from that mistake? Are we about to make those same mistakes as social justice warriors in not being able to talk about the cultural DNA that we want to honor and conserve from our cultures and traditions, from only speaking about what we want to break down and tear apart rather than what we also want to build from? So being a smart troublemaker requires a lot of learning on the job. And then when you get kicked out, learning from that job that you tried to do but failed. I hope we're beginning to give you a framework so that you can get on the balcony, so that you have confidants who can pull you up by the collar and say, okay, wait a second, I see you're about to make this mistake again. Let's cool your jets and think clearly and analytically about what might be the best next move.
The next question was about how does the quality of the charisma influence leadership and authority, and if people can just pander effectively if they're charismatic.
Charisma is an enormous tool for gaining authority, because charisma often enables you to convey a sense of certainty, and certainty sells. So if we go back to the slide that I was showing you, one of the key determinants of, do you appear trustworthy? Do you look trustworthy? Now, it's not actually, are you trustworthy? Because people can easily be fooled and misled. We see a lot of times people gaining trust because they're good at lying. Because they're good at lying and telling people what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. So people often trust people for the wrong reasons. And often people trust people because they appear charismatic, because they look certain. And in organizations and in politics, certainty sells, because certainty feels less frightening. Certainty looks like, oh, I see, you say you can deliver, so I'm going to trust you. So charisma is a major source of authorization. But it has nothing to do with leadership itself, because leadership can be practiced with authority, but also without authority. A lot of people practice leadership because, they call people into a process. They might be shy. They might be a non-dominant child in a school, but they raise a question. And they raise a question that gets people to stop and say, wait a second, maybe we haven't thought about this enough. Maybe they're the quiet person in a team meeting, but they're the one raising the question nobody else is willing to ask. They don't have any charisma, but they raise the question. And they do so with enough articulation that it gets people to stop and reflect, and then to address the adaptive work they need to do. That is, to rectify some contradiction in how they're thinking about things. So that's leadership. So it's a deeply ingrained mistake shared by many cultures that charisma is a prerequisite for leadership, or that it means that you are a leader. There are a lot of charismatics who gain enormous authority and they practice no leadership at all. They mislead their community. They're demagogues. In medicine, you would say that they're engaging in malpractice or negligence. They're not really practicing medicine. They're practicing charlatan. They're charlatans. They're good salespeople. But that's not the same as leading people to face into the contradictions and build new capacity so that they can live more truly according to the deeper orienting values rooted in their tradition. Anyway, I hope that begins to answer your question. Obviously, it will generate a lot of confusion because people equate leadership with charisma in the same way that they equate authority with leadership. Charisma, again, is often an important determinant of what enables people to look at you and give you authority. So it's part of the leader-follower, or really the authority-follower dynamic. But it's not part of the leadership dynamic, except in the sense that it can be a tool. I mean, authority is a tool. It's a resource. one can deploy one's charisma to hold people through a sustained period of change in which they're experiencing uncertainty and disturbance. What we would say in this slide comes with the territory of leadership, engaging people in a sustained period of disequilibrium. This purple line here, where you're somehow, where people aren't going to start changing until they reach a threshold of learning. They need to be stimulated to address the tough challenges. But if you overwhelm them, you can blow up the pressure cooker. You need to somehow keep the level of pressure within a productive range of stress. So you're challenging people, but one needs to challenge people effectively, monitoring and regulating the level of disequilibrium in the social system that you're challenging. So charisma can help you do that, because charisma gives you more trust in the bank to work with. Charisma gives you part of what we would call the holding environment. It provides bonds of trust, vertical bonds and authority, sometimes horizontal bonds of social capital that will hold people in the conversation that gets people to then address the difficult questions that are going to cause conflict and division and cause them to fly apart. And in adaptive work, you want to hold people in the conversation. You want a strong holding environment to hold people in the conversation. But to do that, you need strong bonds of loyalty, of affiliation, of trust. And charisma is one source of that. But it's not the only source of that. For example, my guess is that many of you, when you came out, and those of you who did come out to your families or to your friends or neighbors, as a person with an LGBTQ plus identity, you received a lot of resistance, and for some of you, a lot of nastiness. People told you that you were disloyal to your tradition, to your religion, to your heritage, a disappointment to them. You were in the business of disappointing people's expectations. And part of your job was to stay in the game with them, and that's very painful to do, to stay true to them even when they're not being true to you, and to somehow hold them through a sustained period where they do their adaptive work of realizing that, yes, you've changed, but on the other hand, you have not changed. You're still their child. You're still their sibling. You're still their grandchild. You're still they're still your uncle or aunt. You're still their friend. You're still a member of this political community or national community. You still pray in many of the same language and ways that they do, that you're conserving so much. But it takes time for them to realize that your change is small compared to all that's not changed. And that process of renegotiating that loyalty, that you're asking them to renegotiate their loyalty to you, takes time. And in a sense, you have held them, those of you who've succeeded, have held them through a sustained period of disequilibrium, sometimes lasting years. And finally, a new equilibrium is achieved, where they not only can begin to accept you, but they can begin to invite your loved ones, your new loved ones, your partners home on holidays. But that will take time, painful amount of time. But one needs a holding environment to do that. In families, the holding environment is the deep sense of identification and love and loyalty in which as much as that family member is upset with you and disappointed with you, you're still their baby and they still love you and they want somehow to stay in the game, even when they cast you out, even when they treat you as if you were dead, even when they tell you never to come home, they still yearn that you're going to knock on the door and come back. They don't really want you to give up. And it takes enormous courage when you're the one practicing leadership to realize that you're the one dishing out the losses and that you're the one who has to hold them through their change. You're the one leading them. You're the one then having to hold them because you're the one dishing out the losses. You're the one challenging them to face into contradictions in their values and tradition, to renegotiate their own loyalty to some of their own family members, to some of their own religious values. That you're the one challenging them to absorb losses over time. And so you have to hold them. They're not going to hold you. You have to find another place where you're going to be held. And maybe part of the gift of this community is that you've found confidants with whom you can talk, friends with whom you can talk, loved ones who you can talk, who can hold you and put you back together when you feel all broken apart after that ugly encounter in that company or in that family or in that school, so that you can get ready for the next day, so that you can knock on that door again and re-engage in that conversation, that ugly conversation, and help people understand that for all that you're challenging people to change, there's also so much that you're valuing in their tradition and in the shared values and shared identity that is to be preserved. And that process then of engaging people in those three questions, and yourself as well, that takes time. So charisma can help, but charisma won't go everywhere, because, as soon as you begin to really raise tough questions to people, your charisma is going to mean what we would say in my Jewish culture, chopped liver. It isn't going to mean very much. It isn't going to take you very far. I mean, think how far the deep love of a parent for a child, how challenged that can become when you come out to your family, for some of you. So how far will charisma take you as a bond that will help you hold people through a period of disequilibrium? It'll help you to some degree, but it's not a mark of leadership. It's just one of the tools in the toolkit.
Ron, we're down to the last 10 minutes. Do you want to do the staying alive content, or do you want to take more questions?
What do you think would be best, Diego? I just really want to be helpful to people. My heart so goes out to people working these justice issues that are so deeply personal and not only at a distance, political.
So I think there's some interesting questions that go to the intersection of both that I think maybe we could continue. One of the questions here is about in LGBTQ movements where communities are often fighting for urgent rights and protections, how do leaders balance the urgency of justice with the slower realities of adaptive change?
In the first thing I learned when I started training in surgery from my father was, you go faster by going slower, because the faster you try to move, the more mistakes you make. And then it takes more time to clean up your mistakes. The progressive community has created an unnecessary level of backlash. It's made profound strategic mistakes, tactical mistakes. And as a product of that, I believe it's going to take longer to achieve some of these justice hopes than it would have. So it requires enormous patience but it also requires the discipline, the self-discipline to keep getting on the balcony and asking at a strategic level, what mistakes am I likely to make? What are the larger systemic dynamics that are at foot? You know, I'm getting cheered on by my constituency, but am I connecting with the larger community around me? Let me show you another critical slide. In leadership, one has to do the diagnostic work of asking for any leadership challenge, who are the relevant community of interested parties? Who needs to change if we're going to make progress on this collective challenge? And frequently, if you're situated, you know, in one location, in one of these orange, you know, parabolas, you're only listening to the people in your own faction, and they're cheering you on. They're cheering you on. They're watching you go way out on a limb, and until that limb breaks, and then that limb breaks, you fall down, and they're saying, well, you are a hero, but you were actually stupid. You made some really dumb mistakes. And the dumb mistakes, like from my point of view, getting Donald Trump elected, is a product of not having spent enough time going around the whole circle of interested parties and asking yourself, what's their point of view? What are their loyalties? What changes am I asking them to make? What changes am I asking what changes am I asking this next group to make? And how about this faction over here? You know, without asking who needs to learn what if we're going to make progress on this challenge, you're really likely to passionately walk yourself right into a wall, drive right into a wall. And then, of course, the people behind you will cheer you on. They'll say, well, you were heroic. That was heroic suicide. But did you actually move the cause forward? And now some people will create a theory of change. I disagree with it. That, well, you know, you have to create a mess, and then it creates a counter mess, and then you create a counter mess, and somehow there's going to be progress. Well, I think that's enormously inefficient. I think if you're going to challenge people, you have to respect the pains of change that you're asking people to sustain. You have to have empathy for what you're asking somebody who's strongly antagonistic towards your view. You have to really try to put yourself in their shoes and ask, what loyalties would they have to renegotiate? How would they have to turn around to their own families, to their own friends, to their own neighbors, and be accused of betrayal? What would these folks have to face into? What kinds of painful change am I asking them to sustain? Because you can't develop a strategy of change just by attacking people. You have to engage people in facing into the internal contradictions in their own value set. And you can't engage people in the internal contradictions in their own value set if you can't apprehend, if you can't do the diagnostic work of learning about those values. Unfortunately, most people in any social movement, they spend most of their time dancing with their own people. And they spend much less time dancing with the opposition, so they never see the larger dance floor. They never see who's dancing over there and who's dancing over there and who's dancing to this kind of music. So leadership requires partners to pull you back on the balcony, to get a systemic view so that you can do the analytical work of asking, what am I missing? Who am I missing? Where has my curiosity plummeted? Where have I lost any empathy? What don't I appreciate about those people who still um, talk about God as a he, or who still raise a Confederate flag, or who still X and Y and Z, whatever. What don't I appreciate about their culture and heritage? Because I think the same is true for us. When people ask us to change, to go back to our own people and disagree with them and risk being cast out, it's a problem. We don't want to do it. We also want to conform to the expectations of people within our own particular faction. So leadership requires the capacity to stay in the game with people and to try to understand the nature of the losses you're asking them to sustain, in particularly the losses of loyalty in changing some of their views and values. Because those views and values are anchored in loyalties to people. They're not abstractions. They're loyalties to people who gave them those values and views. And so when you're asking them to change those views, you're asking them to renegotiate loyalties with people who they care about. In a way, the same process that many of you have experienced in trying to renegotiate asking your own families to renegotiate loyalties with you, in leading those families to change, you're asking those members of your family to now back up into their own heritage and renegotiate loyalties within their own families, within their own ancestry, within their own hearts. And that's a big ask. So you can't practice leadership if you don't know the ask. What are you really asking of people? And many times people in the social justice community get pretty full of self-righteous indignation that their ask is right, without any real empathic appreciation for the significance of the ask in terms of disloyalty and betrayal to that you're asking other people to sustain. Now, I think we have to challenge people to do that work of renegotiating loyalties. But we first have to know that that's the work we're engaging people in doing. And if we know that that's what we're actually asking people to do, that that's the nature of the ask, then we would approach them, I think, quite differently. We wouldn't treat it as trivial. We wouldn't treat it as, of course, you stand for equality. You say America, for example, stands for equality, but yet look how we're living. Of course, you're going to accept it as if it's an analytical question. But it's not an analytical question. You're asking people to face into contradictions embodied in their loyalties to people in their own networks of friends, family, community, and ancestry. So that's where the work is. And that's what we're challenging people to do in the practice of leadership on behalf of social justice.
Ron,
And that requires a lot of patience and staying in the game.
Ron, we're out of time. I just wanted to make sure that you knew. But happy to stay for whoever wants. Ying is going to put some links in the or Anakrina for everyone to get more information. But we're just so incredibly thankful for you for coming, talking about this. I think for us in this space, which we are at a university that gets to the hard questions and gives people frameworks and ideas that are sometimes hard to listen to, but are worth considering. This is exactly what we want to do. And I think you've given us quite a good amount of food for thought, especially in this turbulent global time with populism that is really targeting our communities on what went wrong what factions and people we're not listening to, what losses are being ignored, and how fast it changes versus how much people can absorb at a certain time. So just incredibly helpful for us to do this. Happy if there's, if you want any closing remarks, but just wanted to make sure the folks who had to go feel free to do so.
I just would like to conclude by saying, those of you who are still on, that I don't think I completely did justice to the question: how do you stay in the game when you're living with tragedy every day, when you're living with injustice every day, when there's true terrible losses that people are sustaining every day? I think it's really hard. I think it takes a lot of faith that somehow over time progress can be made. I think we can take encouragement from the progress that has been made over the last, over all of your lifetimes. Certainly in the LGBTQ community, there has been enormous progress that's been made. But there's still a lot of tragedy to live with every day. And leadership takes a lot of stomach for that pain. And I think that's why it's so important that in addition to having confidants to talk to, we also have sanctuaries to go to. Places where we can restore ourselves, where we can have sort of a larger sense of faith in the ongoing human experiment, where we can be restored to our sense of purpose over time, where we can distinguish ourselves from our roles, where we can realize, okay, I'm losing this battle, but that's not all of who I am. There are other places I can go to anchor myself. My music, my poetry, my sports, my going to the gym, my being out in nature, my meditation, my prayer. There are other places to anchor me, where I can remember who I am, that who I am is more than the cause. That however important my cause is, it's not all of who I am. That even if I'm going to be a professional social justice warrior, which means my person is my profession, it's still not all of who I am. I am more than the particular identity called LGBTQI+. I am also many other things. Just as every child is so much more than any of the identities they begin to learn and begin to absorb when they're 2 or 3 years old. They have a self that's prior to any identity. Any 2 or 3-year-old, they have agency, they have autonomy, they know this is their body, that's your body, they know this is my emotion, that's your emotion, they know I want this, I don't want that. They have empathy, they have curiosity, but they don't know if they're a boy, a girl, an American, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim. They don't know if they're a Hindu or a Chinese. They don't know all of those identities are social constructs that they internalize over time. And over time, they begin to mistake the self that they had originally, that all of us have, the self, which is like the vessel, into which they begin to bring in all these identities. They begin to confuse these identities with the self. Well, we need confidants who can remind us that who we are, that the self is more than any of these identities. We need sanctuaries to be reminded that who we are is more than any of these individual identities. To return ourselves, in a sense, to the innocence and the curiosity and the total empathic imagination that we all had when we were 3, 4, and 5 years old. Before each of these identities began to give us algorithms of instructions. If you're a boy, then do this. If this, then that. If this, then that. If this, then that. And begin to limit our curiosity and our empathy according to those social constructs. So I think we have to stay in the game, even though we live with tragedy every day.
Thank you so much, Ron. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We are going to be doing much more work with both Ron and folks from his network, LGBTQ activists that have taken this framework and done more with it. And so we're excited to challenge all of us in this community with these critical conversations that hopefully lead us to more insights and answers on the important work at the center that needs to be done. So
You're so
thanks,
welcome.
everybody. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you so much, everybody. You take care. All blessings to you.